Okay, so here we are sitting with Dave Naylor, who is a geologist and who worked most of his life as a consultant for the oil and gas industry around the world, really. Yeah?
Mm-hmm.
So welcome to the GEOCOAST, Dave.
Thank you very much.
Thanks very much for having us here. And what can you tell us, like, how did you get your interest in oil and gas? Like, why you connected your life with exploring oil and gas?
It's rather strange. At the time that I qualified as a geologist, there were very few jobs available in the British Isles. There were probably only half a dozen, because these were in the days before the North Sea or before environmental studies or such things. And you were more or less obliged as a geologist to go overseas. And of the 6 people who qualified at the same time that I did, 2 went to Canada, 2 went to Africa, including myself, 1 to Australia, and 1 stayed behind as a UK academic. So it was understood that if you did geology, you almost certainly would have to travel to get work. And strangely, I didn't go immediately into the oil and gas industry. I took a job first off with a mining company, Anglo-American, who sent me on a boat in those days out to Cape Town to work in Africa.
Okay.
And I was actually due to go to East Africa, but ended up instead on the diamond fields in West Africa, Southwest Africa, now Namibia, working on alluvial diamonds, marine and alluvial diamond deposits. I suppose I'd always been more interested in soft rocks, that is sedimentary rocks, than older granites and metamorphic rocks. And I was quite interested in the work in Southwest Africa. However, I'd saved up some money during the work there and came back to Trinity College in Dublin to do a postgrad degree, and I was fortunate that I got funding from Shell, who at the time were looking for someone to undertake a study of a particular transition in the rocks of the south of Ireland. They were doing a pan-European study of that same system, and they were looking for someone to do the western end of it. So I suppose gradually I got to know the people in Shell, and I worked for them for 2 or 3 years to produce this report, and at the same time get my PhD. And then I got on to the staff at Trinity, and I was teaching sedimentary rocks there, sedimentology and sedimentary rocks there. So that I suppose those were my basic interests, and eventually I didn't feel I was cut out for a life in the academic sphere, so I was recruited by Chevron to join them in North America, and I went out to Calgary in Alberta, which was the center of the oil industry in Canada. And I worked for Chevron for 4 or 5 years, mainly in the north of Canada, going up in the summer with field parties up there. I was leading a field party in the Yukon and the North Richardson Mountains in the extreme north of Canada.
So you started working onshore? Yeah.
I started working onshore. There was very little offshore work at the time. I mean, the first...
So there was no exploration of oil or gas done offshore when you were starting?
Not very much. The first step out into the water had been in Venezuela into very shallow water, and gradually people were starting to think about that.
So like this transition from onshore oil exploration to the offshore, it happened in your lifespan, like you witnessed all this?
Absolutely. At the time I left Chevron and moved back to the UK, and in London I set up a small consultancy with a friend. Mm-hmm. At this time there was very little activity in the UK. There had been some discoveries which had really arisen from a large field discovery in Holland, and the realization that possible fields like that, gas fields, could be found in the offshore area. And there'd been a gradual tentative move into the southern part of the shallow southern part of the North Sea, where a number of gas fields had been found. But that phase was almost quiescent when we were consulting, and our first consulting jobs were overseas in Turkey and West Africa and various places. And it was only after we'd been established for a couple of years that the first of the oil discoveries began to be made in the north. And in a sense, the progression of the offshore exploration has gone hand in hand with the progression of the technology.
But when you started your consultancy in London, was it mainly desktop-based data interpretation, or were you actually physically going into the field where the work been carried out?
We were going to into the field to sit wells, to act as control on seismic vessels, but mostly away from London. Into the Middle East. I sat a well in the Persian Gulf during that period, and it was only gradually that the pace in the North Sea increased. And as it did, people moved further north. The water was deeper, slightly deeper, but in those days 200 meters would have seemed like an extreme depth. Most companies refused to look at any prospects beyond 200 meters water depth. And that more or less went in line with the drilling rigs. There were a lot of drilling rigs that demanded shallow water, the jack-up rigs that actually stood on the seabed, and the quality of the seismic. Now if people saw the seismic, they'd wonder how we managed to make anything out of it if you compare it with modern seismic.
So it was all on rolls of paper?
Yes, it was all printed out by hand, and then it was manually
interpreted with a pencil, is it?
With coloured pencils and so on. We thought a magic breakthrough was when you were able to digitizing tables came in, and you didn't have to do all the actual shot point measuring by hand.
I remember I've worked with some of this data, like with archival data collected by the Geological Survey for the Irish Sea when we were doing a project on sand and gravel. I was interpreting the data for the last 30 years before the GPS came
Yes.
in, so I have the idea what you're talking
Yes.
about. It's like kilometers and kilometers of rolls of
Sure,
paper.
absolutely, and people made discoveries using that, but very crude, very crude.
Do you remember what year was your first offshore job?
I suppose it would have been 1970. That would be the first time.
Okay.
And then gradually we grew in size as a consultancy, and we had people sitting wells for various clients, and sometimes for just major companies who wanted a well site geologist in the North Sea.
So 1970, now it's 2017, so we can say you work in offshore oil and gas for nearly half a century.
Yes, that's
it's 47
right.
years. Huh?
Yes, that's right. And strangely, one of the first jobs I did was to write a report on the Celtic Sea.